he rang the bell, and then he called me in, and I rushed in and said, "Yes, Srila Prabhupada." By the way, that was a new expression at that point, even in '68. Before, it was only Swamiji, only months before. "Yes, Srila Prabhupada." And he looks at me and he goes, "First of all, you have forgotten to pay your obeisances." So I go like this, because I had rushed in, right out of the sleeping bag, hit the floor, and then I hear this chuckling, chuckling going on. Srila Prabhupada's kind of low chuckle. And he says, "That's all right, that's all right. It's all just for practice." So then he called me over. He said, "Come on, sit down." He said, "Why have you called me here to Santa Fe, and then you tell me to go to Los Angeles?" Now, of course, I had nothing to do with this. I was barely 18, in the movement for 2 months. And Srila Prabhupada's, so I figured out later he just kind of wanted to talk to me, loosen me up a little bit. But at the time I was kind of startled. "So why have you called me here to Santa Fe, and then you tell me to go?" So I said, "Well, Srila Prabhupada, Govindadasi," and that's as far as I got. Here I was a brahmachari, and he was going to train me. "Govindadasi, never listen to a woman." It's as far as I got. Now, he loved Srila Govindadasi. Govindadasi would go wherever he went, or he would send her in advance to check things out. He trusted her very much. She and her husband did illustrations for books and so forth. But kind of in a tease, he says, "Never listen to a woman." Then he leans back, looks at me again and said, "So what did she say?" So I said, "Well, Srila Prabhupada, I mean, she said that, this is a very elevated place, Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's on the Continental Divide." He looks at me and says, "You're an intelligent boy." I don't know why, just because I mentioned Continental Divide. "And we're up in the, upper atmosphere here. The air is thin, and you're a heart patient. And, oh, so you think I will come here and die?" He opens up his eyes really wide. So now I don't know what to say, Just says, "Oh, so many people are living here? I cannot come?" So that conversation, then we chanted japa. And actually, before he did that, he sang, or kind of recited the samsara prayers. We're just the two of us there. And he sat and he was just, as Srila Prabhupada would often do, rub his knee as he sat. And samsara dava nalalita loka, he just sang it, and recited it without kartals or mridanga or anything. And then we chanted japa. So I found a piece of cloth. Again, back then, we couldn't even afford to have flowers in the temple. It was temples usually didn't even have telephones back then. The payphone around the corner was the method of communication. So we didn't have any money or something to give Srila Prabhupada, but I found a cloth in an abandoned Catholic church, old rustic thing, and in the cloth itself was a beautiful piece of luxurious velvet with some trim on it. So I showed it to Srila Prabhupada and said, "Could you use this?" And actually, Govindadasi saw it, and she said, "Tosan, Krishna wants to know if you want this." And things were being packed. Srila Prabhupada's pointing, "Put this thing away, put this here, now roll this, put this here." He's being very exacting. And he says, "I want nothing." And the room shook. It was just like Lord Nrsingadev had entered the room. We were just, Srila Prabhupada's so sweet, and then "I want nothing." The room shook. And I didn't know what was going to happen with that piece of cloth after that. Well, I did visit Srila Prabhupada in Los Angeles only 2 months later, and Srila Prabhupada was using it as his backdrop for his deities. So I thought it was, he wants nothing, but he'll engage it for his deities. Backtracking a bit, in I think it was 1971, I was drafted. I was living in Washington, D.C., the national capital. And here I was, I got draft notice. And so I wrote Srila Prabhupada, I said, what should I do? He said, I'll write you a letter. So he wrote this letter. The key line was, my disciples do not have time to squander in these activities. Anyways, I presented that paper. And luckily, my draft board was San Francisco. I had to register in San Francisco. So I guess, anyways, it worked. Srila Prabhupada's letter worked. I remember at that lecture that night, someone dressed as people did back then, almost like in the hippie era, long robes with moons and stars and long hair, very carefully arranged, came in and sat erect during the entire lecture and then stared, glaring almost at Srila Prabhupada, said, what about Buddha? And so Srila Prabhupada said, what about Buddha? He just stared him right back. And he said, well, can you see God? And Srila Prabhupada says, no, you are in the way. So the funny thing is that whoever it was smiled after that and was not in the least bit annoyed and stayed around afterwards. Later on, I worked with the famous road show with the Radha Damodar. And anyways, we got to marketing the road show. This was in '72. It was a little bit, we were on thin ice, we thought at the time, with the music. Srila Prabhupada listened to the music. He liked it. He actually later on went to a large performance we had in Pittsburgh, and he liked it. Gave a lecture there. But early on, I was asked to show Srila Prabhupada the advertising material we had. So I was engaging ISKCON artists, and I saw the cover of the Srimad Bhagavatam recently completed by Murlidhar, which was a remake of Srila Prabhupada's original one that he had done in Delhi back in who knows when, '64 or something, and the ones that Srila Prabhupada brought. So it was a remake. And so this poster was largely utilizing that art. And I said, so Srila Prabhupada, this actually was your idea, pointing to the fact that Srila Prabhupada had designed the cover of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And he looked at me like, nice try. Like you're trying to, it's your idea. The disciple is trying to flatter. And he just looked at me like pitiful. And he says, what my idea? It is all in Shastra. So Srila Prabhupada would never go for that. The Rathyatra in '76 was the first Rathyatra in New York. There had been many attempts to have small ones in Central Park without permits, but it's a very, very difficult city to get a permit in. And there had been a mayor's edict in 1962 saying no new parades on Fifth Avenue. And yet somehow or other, now with the advent of our new temple, the 55th Street Temple, and the moving of Radha Govinda into Manhattan, which is what Srila Prabhupada had wanted, there was to be a Rathyatra. ISKCON was to be 10 years old now, 1976. So for the birthday celebration, there was to be a Rathyatra on Fifth Avenue. Well, how to do that? No, it's illegal. So Srila Prabhupada even called from India to find out if we had gotten the permit on the telephone, which is very rare in those days for Srila Prabhupada, because even get a phone call from India was difficult. There was no good phones. And he specifically asked. And the police department had initially said yes, and then it said no. And I was in charge of getting this permit. So it's a long story, and it's an interesting one. But since Srila Prabhupada is the focus, I'll just say that in the very end, I had so-called last piece of paper to be signed by the chief of police himself in what was called then Police Plaza 1 the south tip of Manhattan. And they said, we're just going to run it down, and he's going to sign it, it's going to be over. And I said, no, I'm going to run it down. So they said, all right, if you want, you can go. I said, I will, thank you. Because Srila Prabhupada had called on the phone. I get down, take the subway down to that particular building, go through all kinds of heavy security, get up to the right floor, and find his secretary. And she looks at the paper and says, he's never going to sign this. She quotes, there's a mayor's edict, no new parades on Fifth Avenue. I ignored her. I hopped over the turnstile, which was some kind of a minimal barricade, went right into the guy's office. It was like out of a movie, a big fat guy, been in the force for 1,000,000 years. I put it on his desk and say, you're to sign this, if you will. He looks at it, starts chuckling, and says, I don't know why I'm doing this. Now, of course, I did by now. Srila Prabhupada wanted it. Srila Prabhupada wanted it, and Krishna in his heart. And he seriously looks right at me and he says, I don't know why I'm doing this. And he signed it. So here he was, the leader of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. We're looking in mundane terms here. It was, in effect, the birthday of ISKCON, July of '76. He's surrounded by disciples praising him. And what does he do? He turns to Tamal Krishna Maharaj, who was then GBC president of the New York Temple, and he said, who did it? He doesn't say, I did it. Because all of ISKCON, of course, was operating off of his energy very clearly. Or yes, it's all glorious. He turns to him and says, who did it? He knows things happen, as he says in the very introduction of the Srimad Bhagavatam, that everything comes down to people, to persons. And it's a personal movement. So Tamal Krishna Maharaj said, well, Jayananda built the carts and Tosan Krishna got all the permitting. And so Srila Prabhupada, right then and there, wrote me a thank you letter. So it's interesting. It's a note. What I always remember most about Srila Prabhupada was that he was very youthful all the time. Remember, in taking walks with him, it was hard to keep up with him. I remember in Los Angeles, I think we were delivering tapes of the roadshow to Srila Prabhupada, and so that he could give us his comments on them, the music, later on, Mangalananda and so forth. And there was 5 or 6 of us on this walk, and we were puffing and couldn't keep up with Srila Prabhupada. So amidst all of his worldwide, his concerns, headaches, so to speak, his age and all his responsibilities, he remained a Vaikuntha man. He was always above it. In one sense, he seemed to be right in there, dealing with all the details. But it was always quite apparent that he was with Krishna. And he was a transcendental man, a Vaikuntha man, as he described his own Guru Maharaj. Je anilo premadana karuna prachu